Imagine waking up one morning and finding out that the conflict you thought was far away is no longer distant. Flights are canceled. Oil prices spike overnight. Your local currency starts shaking. Food prices rise quietly, without warning. No bombs fall near your home. No soldiers march through your streets. And yet, your life begins to change. Because modern conflicts don't stay on borders. They travel through economies, fear, media, and power. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself something uncomfortable. What if the conflict everyone is watching right now, dose and tea, stop where it is? What if it pulls in neighbors, allies, rivals, and eventually the entire world? This is not a movie plot. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is how global conflicts actually begin. And once they start spreading, history shows they rarely stop on their own. Before we go any further, take a second and think. Have you ever wondered why wars today feel closer, even when they happen thousands of miles away? If you've ever asked yourself, how does this affect me? Why should I care? What happens next? Then you're already part of this conversation. Share your thoughts in the comments as you watch, because this video isn't about choosing sides. It's about understanding what really happens when conflicts spread and why ordinary people always pay the highest price. Now, let's clear something important right away. This video is not about one specific war, not one country, not one headline, because history shows us something dangerous. The moment we focus on only one conflict, we miss the pattern that creates the next 10. This documentary is about any conflict that begins with tension between nations. Protests turning violent, borders becoming fragile, or superpowers choosing silence or sides. It could be a regional war, a long-running occupation, a political crisis turning militarized, or a proxy conflict hiding behind diplomacy. What matters is what happens when that conflict spreads, because once it does, the rules change. Most people imagine conflict spreading like this. One country attacks, another responds. War expands, but that's not how it really happens. Conflicts spread quietly first. Through economic pressure, political alliances, intelligence operations, media narratives, and fear-driven decisions. Long before soldiers cross borders, decisions are already made. Let's break this down. Stage 1. When neighbors are forced to choose. Every conflict begins with a center, and around it are neighbors who didn't ask to be involved. These neighboring countries face impossible choices. Stay neutral and risk angering powerful allies. Support one side and invite retaliation. Close borders and face humanitarian crises. Neutrality sounds safe. In reality, neutrality is often punished because powerful nations don't ask, "Do you want to get involved?" They ask, "Which side are you on?" And silence is often interpreted as betrayal. Once neighbors are pressured, alliances come into play. Military pacts, economic agreements, security guarantees. On paper, these alliances promise protection. In reality, they act like dominoes. One falls, others follow. History is filled with wars that began small, then exploded because alliances forced participation. Not because nations wanted war, but because they were bound by promises made decades earlier. And when alliances activate, conflict spreads faster than diplomacy can stop it. Here's a question many people ask. If powerful countries can stop this, why don't they? The answer is uncomfortable. Because powerful nations don't react emotionally, they react strategically. They wait, they observe, they calculate. They ask who benefits, who weakens, who gains leverage. Sometimes letting a conflict spread slightly creates the perfect excuse for intervention later. Not to save lives, but to reshape influence. This waiting period is the most dangerous phase. Because while leaders calculate, people suffer silently. The moment a conflict expands beyond one country, the battlefield moves into the global economy. This is where everyone gets involved, whether they want to or not. oil prices rise. Shipping routes become risky. Currencies lose stability. Inflation creeps into daily life. You may not hear explosions, but your wallet feels the impact. Sanctions are imposed. Trade routes shift. Jobs disappear quietly. And governments call it collateral damage. One of the most dangerous aspects of expanding conflict is normalization. At first, breaking news, emergency headlines, constant updates. Then slowly, fewer headlines, less outrage, more acceptance. People adjust. Until one day, what once shocked the world becomes background noise. That's when conflicts spread without resistance. This is where mindset matters. Humans adapt quickly, even to crisis. Fear becomes routine. Violence becomes distant. Empathy becomes selective. And when empathy fades, decision-makers face less pressure to stop escalation. Because silence looks like approval. Every spreading conflict reaches a moment where leaders quietly realize, stopping now would cost more than continuing. That's the moment diplomacy weakens. That's when ceasefires fail. That's when escalation becomes logical, not emotional. And once that threshold is crossed, the conflict no longer belongs to one region. It becomes global risk. At this point, the world still believes. This can be controlled. Borders still exist. Markets still function. Flights still take off. But beneath the surface, something has already changed. Trust is gone. Fear is rising. And power is shifting hands. Because when conflicts spread, they don't just change maps, they change how nations think, how leaders act, and how people live. Have you ever noticed how the biggest changes in the world don't arrive with a bang? The moment a conflict starts to spread, there's no global alarm. No official announcement that says, from today, everything is different. Instead, the world shifts quietly. Diplomatic language gets colder. Public statements become meticulously scripted. Words like concern, monitoring, and strategic patience replace any sense of urgency. On the surface, life for most of us continues as normal. But underneath, the very foundations of global power are beginning to move. Because when conflicts expand, they don't just destroy cities, they rearrange the entire world order. As more countries get drawn into the orbit of a conflict, a critical shift happens in the minds of leaders. They stop asking, "How do we end this?" and they start asking a far more dangerous question. How do we position ourselves for what comes after? That single change in thinking alters everything. Direct, open confrontation becomes too risky. No major power wants to be seen as the one who started a bigger, more devastating war. So, the conflict doesn't stop, it just changes form. It moves into the shadows. This is the birth of proxy wars. Instead of armies facing each other on a declared battlefield, weapons start moving quietly across borders. Funding flows through untraceable back channels. Special forces conduct training in secret locations. Officially, the powerful nations involved will insist they are not participating. Unofficially, they are the ones shaping the entire battlefield. Proxy wars are incredibly effective tools for them. They allow powerful nations to test their latest weapons, to drain their rivals' economies, to destabilize entire regions, and to influence the outcome of a war, all without ever claiming accountability. But for the people who live in these proxy zones, the war becomes a nightmare without an end. Because these conflicts aren't designed for a quick victory. They're designed for control and exhaustion. Have you ever wondered why these proxy wars seem to drag on forever? It's because there is no clear finish line. If one side wins too quickly, the external power backing them loses its influence in the region. If one side loses completely, all leverage disappears. So the conflict is deliberately kept alive, simmering at a low boil. Ceasefires are mysteriously broken just when they seem to be working. Peace talks collapse over minor, unexpected disagreements. Violence suddenly spikes right when it looks like a negotiation might succeed. From the outside, it all looks like chaos and incompetence. But from the inside, it's a grim, calculated strategy. While global powers play a deadly game of chess, civilians become the pawns sacrificed to maintain a strategic balance. At the exact same time, the physical war spreads. Another, or insidious war, intensifies a war that reaches every single one of us, no matter where we live. The war for the narrative. This is the moment when information itself becomes a weapon. Headlines are framed to provoke a specific reaction. Images are strategically selected to generate anger or sympathy. Language is carefully chosen to trigger emotion, not to foster understanding. The goal is no longer just to win territory, it's to win perception. Why? Because public opinion is the ultimate prize. It controls elections, it justifies economic sanctions, it builds support for military aid, and it grants international legitimacy. And here's the most dangerous part. Once people choose a side based on emotion, facts become secondary. This is how truth dies during an expanding conflict. When multiple countries and their media outlets are involved, truth becomes fragmented. Each side presents its own version of events, and each version feels complete and convincing on its own. But each version is also hiding something crucial. Soon, you see blatant contradictions everywhere. The same event is blamed on different actors. The same photograph is used with a completely different context. The same casualties are used to justify opposing arguments. Most of us don't have the time or resources to investigate every claim. So, what do? We choose the version of the story that feels most familiar, the one that confirms our existing beliefs, the one that speaks to our deepest fears. And that is how propaganda truly succeeds. Not by telling outrageous lies, but by weaponizing selective truths. In past decades, wars spread through military alliances and treaties. Today, they spread through our screens. A single video goes viral, and suddenly millions are outraged. A powerful image is shared, and it sparks a global debate. A hashtag starts trending, and it divides entire populations. Social media doesn't create the conflict, but it acts as a powerful accelerator for emotion. On these platforms, anger spreads faster than context, fear spreads faster than facts, and outrage spreads much, much faster than any calm, rational solution. World leaders are watching these reactions very closely. They monitor social media trends because a surge in public emotion gives them the justification they need to act. When public outrage is at its peak, escalating a conflict becomes much easier to sell. As the conflict widens, governments begin a subtle but deliberate process. They don't make loud announcements about preparing for war. Instead, they start conditioning the public to accept what might be coming. You'll start hearing certain phrases more and more often. Phrases like "we face difficult times ahead," "we must protect our national interest due to security concerns," and "necessary sacrifices will be required." Behind the scenes, government budgets quietly shift. Defense spending gets a boost. New emergency laws are debated. It's nothing dramatic or alarming at first. It's just enough to psychologically prepare the population so that when bigger steps are taken, public resistance is minimal. Soon, the economic pressure of the conflict starts to turn into political pressure at home. As more countries get involved, global supply chains weaken. Energy shortages might appear. Inflation starts to rise, hitting everyone's wallet. At first, governments will blame these problems on abstract external forces. Then, they'll start to blame their rivals. Eventually, they'll start blaming each other. As economic hardship grows, so does internal tension. Protests might emerge. The political opposition gains momentum. The national unity that was so strong at the beginning starts to crack. And this creates a dangerous cycle. The external conflict fuels internal instability. And that internal instability pushes leaders toward more aggressive foreign policy as a way to redirect public anger outward, away from themselves. When the world feels uncertain and threatening, A specific kind of nationalism begins to rise. It's not the positive, cultural kind that celebrates heritage. It's a defensive, emotional nationalism built on fear. People start hearing and repeating slogans like, "We must protect ourselves. They're a threat to our way of life, and our nation is under attack." Fear strengthens our sense of group identity. That identity hardens the idea of borders. And those borders create deeper and deeper divisions. In this kind of environment, compromise starts to look like weakness. And once compromise becomes politically shameful for a leader, finding a path to peace becomes almost impossible. This is why diplomacy begins to fail. Diplomacy relies on trust, and trust relies on a degree of predictability. But an expanding conflict destroys both. Agreements that were signed are quietly broken. Promises become flexible and conditional. Red lines that were drawn are constantly moved. Negotiations start to feel more like performances than genuine attempts at finding solutions. Everyone shows up to the peace talks, but no one actually expects them to succeed. The real decisions aren't being made in the conference rooms. They're being made in military command centers, in intelligence agency briefings, and in closed-door economic councils. Public diplomacy becomes theater, while private strategy becomes the cold, hard reality. As tensions rise across the globe, the margin for error shrinks to zero. A small border incident, a misinterpreted military maneuver, a technical malfunction on a radar system, events that would normally be contained and escalated suddenly carry the risk of global consequences. Why? Because multiple nations are already on high alert. Every side is now assuming the worst-case scenario. Each reaction is a little more extreme than the last. Each response makes it harder for the other side to back down. This is how unintended escalation happens. Not because anyone wanted a full-scale war, but because a chain reaction of fear-driven decisions became impossible to stop. At some point, there comes a moment when defense analysts and intelligence officials quietly agree on one thing. This is no longer just a regional issue. That conclusion doesn't make the front-page news. It appears in classified reports and is discussed in secret meetings. But from that moment on, all the planning changes. Worst-case scenarios are no longer theoretical. They become active policy guides. Global military alliances are quietly activated. Contingency plans are moved from theory into active preparation. The conflict has officially entered a global risk phase. And with every new country that gets involved, peace becomes exponentially harder to achieve. Each new player adds its own national interests, its own fears, and its own domestic political limits to the equation. A peace deal no longer has to satisfy just two sides, it has to satisfy many, each with a different definition of victory. The more players on the board, the fewer possible moves lead to a solution. Eventually, peace is no longer about resolution. It's about managing chaos. At this stage, the world hasn't collapsed. The stock markets are still open. Diplomats are still meeting. Leaders are still giving speeches about stability. But just beneath that fragile surface, proxy wars are multiplying. Truth has fractured into a million pieces. Economies are straining under the pressure, and a low-level fear has become normalized. The conflict no longer belongs to a distant battlefield. It has entered our homes through our screens. It has seeped into our minds, and it has cast a long shadow over our future. And as the world slowly adjusts to this dangerous new normal, another question quietly begins to form in the halls of power: not if things will escalate further, but what happens when escalation can no longer be controlled? When does a war stop being someone else's problem? For a long time, we believe distance equals safety. If the fighting is far away, it feels abstract. If the headlines don't mention your country, it feels irrelevant. But modern conflicts don't respect borders. They travel through energy shortages, food supply disruptions, and financial instability. Suddenly, problems appear that seem unrelated, yet they all trace back to the same expanding crisis. We start asking questions we never thought we would. Why is everything so expensive? Why does the future feel so uncertain? Why is the world so tense? The source is often a conflict that started thousands of miles away. One of the most dangerous things about global escalation is how normal it feels at first. The changes don't arrive dramatically, they arrive subtly. A price increase here, a product shortage there, a delayed shipment, a new regulation, a longer security check at the airport. Individually, these seem minor, but together they signal a deep, systemic shift. We adapt because we always do. But adaptation slowly turns into acceptance, and acceptance allows the consequences to deepen without resistance. When conflicts expand, the first major pressure point is always resources. Energy routes become unstable. Agricultural supply chains break down. Transportation costs soar. Countries that once depended on imports begin to struggle, while nations that export resources gain enormous leverage. Suddenly, food becomes political. Energy becomes a strategic weapon. Water becomes a source of contention. Humanitarian crises follow, not because food doesn't exist, but because access to it becomes controlled. As conflicts widen, people move, not by choice, but by necessity. Families flee instability, workers search for safety, and entire communities fracture. Neighboring countries absorb the initial pressure, but soon, distant nations feel the impact. Migration becomes politicized. Fear replaces empathy. Borders harden. Instead of addressing the root cause of the displacement, nations argue over who is responsible for the displaced. This division fuels xenophobia and political extremism, creating a vicious cycle of instability that becomes harder to break with each passing year. As economies strain under the weight of global conflict, societies begin to change. Unemployment rises. Living standards fall. The gap between the rich and poor becomes a chasm. People start looking for someone to blame. It could be the government, foreign powers, minority groups, or migrants. Anger needs a target, and during global crises, that target is often manufactured. Leaders use external threats to distract from internal failures. Opposition parties use the instability to challenge authority. The media amplifies the conflict because fear attracts attention. The result is not unity, but deeper polarization. Perhaps the most insidious long-term consequence of expanding conflict is normalization. An entire generation grows up knowing nothing but crisis. Emergency measures become routine. Instability becomes the expected state of affairs. People stop asking, "Why is this happening?" and start asking, "How do we live with it?" This is how extraordinary measures become permanent fixtures of our lives. Surveillance increases. Personal freedoms shrink. Security overrides privacy. And all of it is justified by a single, powerful phrase: because the world is a dangerous place. Global conflicts don't just end. They reshape the world. Some nations emerge stronger, others lose influence permanently, and some fade into irrelevance. International institutions weaken. New alliances form out of necessity, while old systems quietly collapse. The rules that once governed global behavior become flexible, then meaningless. Trust evaporates. A new balance of power emerges, one not based on cooperation, but on deterrence and fear. But the most overlooked cost is generational. Children grow up surrounded by anxiety. Their education suffers. Opportunities shrink. Their dreams become smaller, more cautious. Stability feels like an impossible luxury. When global conflict becomes the constant background noise of life, the future becomes something to be feared rather than planned for. And that loss of hope, that theft of a future, is impossible to measure. This isn't a new story. History shows the same pattern repeating again and again. A conflict begins, it spreads gradually, power shifts, people suffer, and the world resets, always at a terrible cost. Each time, leaders promise this will never happen again, and each time it does. Not because humanity fails to learn, but because the core incentives of power, fear, ambition, control, and survival remain unchanged. So, is there a point where it can still be stopped? The honest answer is uncomfortable. Yes, conflicts can be stopped early. But once they spread beyond a certain point, the solutions become drastically limited. Stopping escalation then requires immense political courage, widespread public pressure, and a willingness to compromise and lose power. These are rare commodities in a world dominated by fear, where aggression is often rewarded more than restraint. You may not control governments or influence global policy. You can't stop a war on your own, but understanding what's happening matters more than you think. Awareness breaks the spell of manipulation. It weakens propaganda and encourages critical thinking. It prevents blind hatred. The moment we stop asking questions is the moment conflict gains unlimited space to grow. If a conflict continues to spread, the world doesn't end in a cinematic explosion. It changes quietly, step by step, decision by decision, compromise by compromise. Until one day, we look back and ask, when did everything become so fragile? The truth is, it didn't happen all at once. It happened while we were all watching something else. The real danger of expanding conflict isn't just the physical destruction, it's the distraction. Distraction from empathy, distraction from accountability, and distraction from the fundamental value of peace. As long as conflicts keep spreading, the greatest risk isn't just what we lose today, but what we slowly, quietly accept losing forever. Thanks for watching. If this gave you something to think about, please consider subscribing.